All right, I'll just wait for a few more people to tune in here. All right, let's wait for a few more people to tune in here. All right. All right, well, thank you all for tuning in to our 4th episode of the Road to Cicerone series. My name is Will Stevens. I'm one of the co-founders of BeerMenus, as well as a certified Cicerone. And today, extremely excited to have with us Neil Witte to talk about draft systems. Neil is not only one of the 11 master Cicerones in the world, but he is also the field quality and training manager at Duvel USA. And he's also a co-author of the Drought Beer Quality Manual. As many of you may know, the Drought Beer Quality Manual is the go-to resource not only for preparing for the Cicerone exams, but also for the entire craft beer industry. Today, we're really lucky to have him here and excited to jump into a discussion of draft systems. So without further ado, here is Neil.
Hello. Thanks for joining, everybody. It's fun to do these types of things, using some modern technology to get the word out instead of just standing in front of a group of people the old-fashioned way. So I'm gonna give a little kind of primer on draft beer. So you know, I was asked to talk about a fairly broad subject in a fairly short period of time, so I've decided to dial it down a little bit and give you guys a kind of primer on dispense gas, because when you talk about draft beer and you talk about troubleshooting and the types of things that can go on with draft systems, it largely involves outside of quality related issues and line cleaning issues. When you talk about pourability and issues that can come up with draft systems, you're often talking about foamy beer or some type of carbonation issue. So that's the most common issue that you come across that from a retailer standpoint is, my beer isn't pouring right, it's foamy. Why is it foamy and I can't explain it? In fact, it's so common that a lot of retailers just simply write it off. They just say, oh yeah, it's just draft beer, it's foamy, that's just what it does. It doesn't have to be like that. So when you talk about troubleshooting a draft system, it's good to understand the basics of carbonation and why we use different types of dispense gas, because that really is kind of the meat on the bone of draft system design and draft system troubleshooting to a large degree. So I put together a few slides for everybody to look at. I'm going to share them with you here, and just one second here. So let's see. So I'm gonna do this. I wonder, should I try it like this? How does that look? Will, are we looking good on this here?
Yeah, that looks great.
Cool. All right. So talk a little bit about CO2 and blended gas. When we talk about dispense gas in a draft system, most people think that the only reason dispense gas is there is to push the beer from the keg to the faucet. And that obviously is a very important role. But there's another really important role as well, and that's to keep the beer properly carbonated. So that's largely because you want it to pour out of the faucet and you want it to taste good as well. The brewer is putting a very specific amount of CO2 in that beer, and it's our goal to make sure that we're maintaining that level of carbonation all the way through the life of the keg. So brewers are measuring this typically in what we call volumes per volume. So if you have, for example, in this picture here, you see 2.5 volumes per volume, or what we would simply call volumes. 2.5 volumes of CO2 in a keg of beer. What does that mean? Well, that means that if you were to remove the CO2 from that keg of beer, that CO2 by itself at a standard temperature and pressure would fill 2.5 equal size containers. So in this case, a keg. So that 2.5 volumes will fill 2.5 kegs by itself. So it's a lot of gas, and it is compressed into one keg of beer that already has the beer in it. So, you know, that's a lot of gas dissolved in liquid. So this gas is very volatile, and it wants to break out. It also wants to absorb into the beer quite readily. So it goes in and out of solution. And in fact, it's going in and out of solution all the time. And so what we want is the same kind of net result of gas going in and coming out of the beer. So in essence, we want to maintain that same CO2 content from the time we tap the beer to the time we pour the last beer in the keg. And so if we have that condition, then that's what we would call a balanced keg. So the balanced keg has, in a manner of speaking, an equal amount of CO2 in the headspace in the beer. And there's two main factors that we need to control when we're striving for this, and this is pressure and temperature. So in this example here, in the picture on the right hand side, you see we have our 2.5 volume beer. And so this beer is being held at 38 degrees and 11 psi of head pressure, for example. So I just want to say for those of you who are wondering, oh my God, I need to go set my pressure regulators to 11 pounds right now. This is not an instruction on the actual numbers. I'm not telling you to put this amount of pressure on your kegs. Each draft system is different. I'm going to use some numbers and figures that are merely examples of that are there just to kind of more prove the concept, kind of demonstrate the concept for you. So don't put too much stock in these numbers. Although they are scientifically based, each draft system is different, and this might not be the right thing for your system. So we want to control pressure and temperature in the keg, and it's a very particular thing. So and it's going to change as those factors change. So for any given temperature that the beer is at, there's only one pressure of straight CO2 that you can apply to keep the keg balanced. So this is a chart that was derived from the American Society of Brewing Chemists solubility studies they did back in the 40s. And on the top row, you can see what is the 2.1 through 3.0. That's the volumes of CO2. And in the left-hand column, you see the temperature. This is the temperature of the beer. So if you follow these together, and I don't know if you can see my pointer here, but if you have, for example, our 2.5 volumes of CO2, and you follow that down to our 38 degrees, you can see this is the applied pressure required that will keep your beer
Neil?
properly carbonated. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. What I'm seeing on the screen is the slide for, looks like the slide for nitro pour.
Really?
Yeah, I think we might not be seeing what you're seeing.
No, not at all. Let me stop sharing there for a second.
Okay.
Pull back out. And did it progress there very quickly?
Unfortunately, we were just seeing the nitro pour slide, I think.
From the very beginning?
Yeah.
Oh. All right. I apologize. Is that all you were seeing the whole time?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, good grief. I'm flipping through the slides here on my end. So are you seeing CO2 blended gas here?
I think we need to turn the screen share back on.
Oof. Sorry about that. Yeah.
No problem at all.
My apologies, everyone. So why don't we just keep it right here? And this might be a little easier.
Yeah,
So
that's perfect.
I think it was the fact that I was in a slideshow mode that may have caused some issues there. All right. So.
Okay, that's perfect.
All right, cool. Now I'm flipping through slides. So I was doing a little slideshow for myself, so I apologize, everyone. All right, so you know, I'll just flip through these real quick. So you can see this diagram here, which I thought I was showing you at the time, is the volumes per volume. This is the diagram that kind of illustrates how we measure CO2 in beer. And this is just a little diagram on the side that I was referring to about our 2.5 volume beer, 11 PSI at 38 degrees. And now we're at the chart that I was talking about here. So at the top of the chart, we've got in this top row, we have the volumes of CO2, and on the left-hand column, we have the temperature. So if we follow this 2.5 volumes of CO2 to the middle here and line it up with 38 degrees, we end up with 11.3. So this is where I'm getting these numbers. So this is, and this is kind of one way to visualize the relationship between the pressure and the temperature. So you can kind of see here as the temperature of the beer would get colder, for example, you go down roughly about a half a pound of pressure required for each degree that you're going, that the temperature is going down. And conversely, as the beer warms up, there's an increase in the amount of pressure required. So this isn't necessarily the best way to look at it. So I'll flip to this next slide here, and this is a lot better visualization of the concept of the relationship between pressure and temperature. So we can see here 3 kegs, and they're being held under 3 different conditions. And really what we're looking at is the 3 possibilities we have of any keg that's on tap. So basically every keg tapped on any draft system anywhere has one of these 3 things happening inside of it. And what we want is this first condition, the one on the far left. That's our 2.5 volume beer, 11 pounds at 38 degrees. We're perfectly balanced. So that first beer you pour is going to be 2.5 volumes of CO2 in it, and the last beer you pour is going to be 2.5 volumes of CO2. And you can see as these conditions change, so does the carbonation level. So in the middle picture, if one of the conditions that would change here would be the pressure increasing. So if we go from 11 pounds to 13 pounds, but the temperature stays the same, now we're increase the pressure, you jack up the pressure, and extra gas starts absorbing into the beer. So you're raising the carbonation level of the beer. The same thing is going to happen if the temperature gets colder. So if we go from 38 degrees to 35 degrees, and we keep the pressure the same at 11 pounds, we're also going to be overcarbonating the beer. So in this instance, we are creating essentially a 2.65 volume beer. So you can imagine that if these parameters are even farther out of whack, we're going to be creating an even higher carbonated beer. The opposite of that is in our last picture here, where we have gas escaping from the beer into the headspace. So the beer is going flat inside the keg. And this can happen when the pressure drops and the temperature stays the same, or when the beer warms up. So we go from 38 to 42, for example. So understanding this concept right here is going to get you a really long way in figuring out why we design draft systems the way we do, and in being able to troubleshoot your draft system, because a good portion of the problems that come up with draft systems have to do with dispense gas or pressure and temperature issues. So this is a real critical concept in understanding how draft systems work. And this is also, by the way, the same content that I use for doing certified Cicerone classes, because in order to really sit down and take a test that may ask you any number of different things about draft beer, I think you really have to understand just generally speaking how a draft system works and how a draft system is set up. And this is a really core concept to understanding draft systems. So let's take this a little bit farther and talk about the application of these principles. So we can go back to our two goals here to keep the beer carbonated and push the beer from the keg to the faucet. And we'll go back to our 2.5 volume beer that we've been using as an example. So this would be a short draw system. Short draw systems are fairly simple. We can take 100% CO2 at 11 psi, a 35-degree cooler, 2.5 volume beer, and that pressure is going to accomplish both goals for us. It's going to keep the beer properly carbonated, and that that pressure is enough to push it a short distance to the faucet. So this short draw system would be your typical kegerator where the faucet is right above the keg, or maybe where you have faucets and shanks running through the wall of a cooler and the kegs are right on the other side. So it's a pretty simple setup, and both goals are accomplished with straight CO2. So where it gets complicated is we start talking about long draw systems. You have maybe a draft system that runs 100 feet, say. So you can put 100% CO2 at 11 psi, 38 degrees on your 2.5 volume keg, and it's going to keep the beer properly carbonated, but 11 pounds is not enough pressure to push it all the way through that much tubing all the way to the faucet. There's too much resistance to flow. So we're really only accomplishing one goal here. There's not a whole lot of point in keeping our beer carbonated if we can't push it to the faucet. So the solution to that is to use a blended gas. So this is really why we have blended gas in draft systems, is to overcome that pressure issue. Because we can't just simply take 100% CO2 and just crank up the pressure to the required pressure to push the beer from the keg to the faucet, because then we would overcarbonate the beer. We are now exceeding that balance point. But if we take our CO2 and we cut it with nitrogen and make a gas blend, then we can achieve a higher pressure. So a lower percentage of CO2 combined with a higher pressure will still keep the beer properly carbonated and give us extra push pressure. So in this instance here, we have 70% CO2 with 30% nitrogen, very commonly used blend. And now we're at 22 pounds of pressure. So 22 pounds will push your beer quite a distance. That's twice as much pressure as what we had with 100% CO2. So that nitrogen is great because it doesn't affect the flavor of the beer. It doesn't readily absorb in the beer. And it just kind of hangs around in the headspace and gives you extra push pressure. So now we're accomplishing both goals. This is really the whole concept behind using a blended gas. So the same thing can apply to a nitro pour. When we're talking about nitrogen infused beers, Guinness being the most common one, but there's a whole bunch of them out there. It's been kind of a trend in the past year and a half, 2 years. So those beers are super low carbonation. We have about 1.2 volumes in your average nitro beer. So that's a super low content of CO2. It's so low that any pressure of 100% CO2 is going to overcarbonate the beer. And if you even approach regular dispensing pressures, like even 11 pounds, you're going to overcarbonate it so much that it'll be completely unpourable within like a day. So there's really no way around using a blend gas here. And the nitro pour blend gas is a totally different blend gas than the one I used for the long draw example. This one is almost the exact opposite blend. Instead of a 70% CO2 blend, we have a 25% CO2 blend, with the balance being nitrogen again. So this is our 25-75 blend. This is going to keep the beer properly carbonated with that low CO2 content, and we're running at about 35 psi, which is really common for nitro pour because we've got a lot of resistance in that creamer faucet that we're pouring the beer through. So it's important to understand the difference between these two types of systems here, and this is maybe one of the biggest dispense gas related quality issues in the marketplace, and it has been for quite a long time. is people using nitro blend gas, 2575 gas, for all of the beers in their draft system. What happens is when you use 25% CO2 on a regularly carbonated beer, that beer is going to go flat. It's not enough CO2 in the blend to keep that beer carbonated. So even at a really high pressure, 25% CO2 will still allow CO2 to escape from the beer, and your beer will go flat. The reason people set this up is oftentimes because it's inexpensive to actually install. So when you're putting in a draft system, you're just simply buying typically a premixed cylinder with those premixed gases of the nitro blend and a regulator for your gas part of the system. Whereas to produce a 70% CO2 blend and a CO2 rich blend, you end up having to buy a gas blender and use two separate sources. So it's a little bit more of an investment. It actually saves you money and pays for itself within the first year for about 90% of the accounts. But, you know, it's still a little bit more of a startup cost. But it's also, you know, it's also going to make sure it's going to save you money in the long run, and it's going to help you pour better beer. So this is kind of the primer for our dispense gas and how dispense gas works. And I guess right now be good to take any questions from you guys if you have them.
Should we jump into questions now? All right, so just running through the questions. First of all, thanks for pointing out the slide issue, everyone out there.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, so one of the first questions that came in, let's see. There's a question on the 2008 exam that had me stumped. When cleaning a long draw system using an electric coil or pump, what velocity of cleaning solution should be achieved and how long should it be maintained? Velocity 2 gallons per minute or blank feet per second. Time is 15 minutes.
Not sure what the question is there.
Let's see, it says velocity equals 2 gallons per minute or blank feet per second, and the time is 15 seconds. The question is, when cleaning a long draw system using an electric coil or pump, what velocity of cleaning solution should be achieved and how long should it be maintained?
Well, so it's asked, so the 2000 exam does have some wonky questions on there that the program did clean up. There's really not anywhere in there, I'm pretty sure, where they're going to be asking you for feet per second on using an electric cleaning pump. The parameters on that that are probably the key points to know would be, you know, so that gallon, we had been saying 2 gallons a minute. I think we're saying 1 gallon a minute right now in the draft beer quality manual. It's 15 minutes of contact time. So 15 minutes of recirculation time would probably be the key point there when it comes to using a line cleaning pump in a draft system.
Gotcha. All right, so the next question is, this one came in before we got started, which foam is better, the one created opening the faucet all the way or the one opening it just a little bit and forcing it? Here in Spain, we call one foam and one cream. Which one is better?
As far if I'm understanding the question right, like what is the best way to create foam on the beer? So, you know, you know, the way we typically do it in the U.S. is we just, you know, try and develop that during the pour. Part of it is understanding your system and pouring it in such a way where a nice head is forming on top. A lot of people like to actually cut that head off the top. And, you know, so get a nice color foam on top, but then if you have any bigger fisheye bubbles or whatever, they'll cut it with the knife to slice that off, and that'll maintain the head for quite a bit longer typically, because those fisheye bubbles, once those pop first, then it kind of starts a cascade of the foam collapsing. So, if you have a faucet that is able to, has that kind of pushback action where you can create some foam on top, that's fine. That's not my preference, because I also think, a lot of brewers are intending for that head to be formed during the pour. So it is acceptable to lose just a little bit of that carbonation in the process. And when you're creating that foam, when you're actually getting gas to break out of the beer and form into a head, it is taking aromas and aroma compounds with it into the headspace. And that I'm not as convinced that that creamer action is going to be replacing the amount of aromas that would be trapped in that headspace normally, as those bubbles are traveling up through the whole glass of beer, as opposed to just taking, an ounce or less of beer and turning that into just solid foam on top. I think in both cases, the head is going to trap volatile aromas in there, and you're going to be able to enjoy them. But I think the natural formation of foam as you're pouring beer into the glass is going to do a little bit better job of bringing more of those aromas into the collar of foam.
Gotcha. All right, so one more question from Megan. It looks like she wrote, in regards to the pressure and temperature when using a 120-foot coiled jockey box, are you measuring the temperature of the beer coming out of the coil or the keg itself?
So great question. So jockey boxes, temporary draft dispense, we take all those rules that I just told you about and we throw them out the window. Unfortunately, we can't really, in those situations, control the temperature of the beer. Most people are using a jockey box in a situation where they're outside during a summer festival or something of the sort. And the intent is that you're going to use those kegs at that single use event. It would be possible maybe to dial in the system around a jockey box, but it'd be very difficult because you have to have a consistently cold keg in order to do that. The jockey box and the coil box have extremely high resistance. We have to put really high pressure on the keg just to get it to pour through the box. And oftentimes we have to put high pressure on the keg to keep the gas in solution so it doesn't break out in the line because the beer might be a little bit warmer. There's a lot of reasons why we kind of throw those rules out the window. So when we have a coil box or a jockey box, we throw those rules out the window. We push, usually a lot of people push with 100% CO2 at a really high pressure, and that'll work for the several hours that you're going to pour the beer. But we just expect that we're not going to try and pour that beer the next day because it'll be overcarbonated.
Gotcha. Next question comes from Alfred. He wrote, "Hey Neil, is 2.5 VV the standard in all kegs, or is it trial and error when testing out the pour and adjusting the PSI as the beer pours?"
Yeah, so that gets to kind of a bigger question about CO2 volumes and what are the CO2 volumes of the different beers? And gee, that's a really good question. Most craft beers range from probably around 2.4 to 2.6. Your regular American craft beers. Domestic beers are going to hover more around 2.7. And a lot of imported beers can range from 2.6 to over 3.0 volumes of CO2. And the issue when we start getting into really dialing beers into the exact temperature and pressure that they need is that oftentimes that CO2 volume information is not available. There's been a lot of discussion in the Brewers Association draft group that I've been working with for a long time now about trying to create a database. It's actually a lot more complicated than you might think to create a full database of everybody's beers. And so, it's We realize that that's kind of a, a stumbling block in designing a great draft system. So there are some methods that we can use to kind of work around. If we really need to know the carbonation level of a beer, there's some methods that we can use. One is the flashlight test. That's a process that you can go through to figure out what the balance point of carbonation is in that keg. I won't go into detail about that process, but it's outlined in the draft beer quality manual. It's in one of the appendices in the back. So you can go to draftquality.org and check that out. So there are ways of figuring out what that is. And there are ways of balancing a keg without knowing that. But it's a little bit of a problem when we try to really dial things in. That piece of information oftentimes isn't there.
Gotcha. The next question, when discussing the economics of proper gas dispensing at an account or during a presentation, are there any parlor tricks you would suggest to convey the message?
The best thing you can do when talking to a retailer about doing the right thing with their draft system is show them the money. That's the bottom line. I've been doing this for a long, long time, and if you don't show them the economics of why they should be doing something, then there's a good chance they're just not going to adopt it. There are, if you look at the draft beer quality for retailers manual that the BA Draft Group produced, I think we rolled that out last year. There are some worksheets in there that allow you to work through figuring out how much taking the amount of money that a retailer is paying for 2575 pre-mixed cylinders, and then being able to figure out how long it would take for them to pay for a gas blender, and how long that payoff period would be. So if they spend, $700-800 on a gas blender, is that, how many months is that going to take to pay off the money that they're typically losing in lost draft sales and in paying through the nose for the most expensive dispense gas out there. So there's some tools in there that you can use, but really it's all about having that money conversation. You got to show them how they're going to make more money.
All right, so the next question from Anthony. What is the normal PSI for a jockey box, and does it change whether it's plate or coil type?
It's going to change more so if it's a coil, it's going to change depending on the length of the coil. And if it's jockey box with a cold plate, it's also going to change depending on the number of faucets, because the number of faucets is going to determine how long the coils are in that plate. And so that all depends on the resistance. The nice thing about throwing the rules out of balancing the keg is that we can just start at a certain pressure, and if we like the flow rate, then we can just keep it there. And if we don't like the flow rate, we can adjust the pressure to get the flow rate that we want, which is a luxury we don't have in regular draft systems, because we're not worried about messing with carbonation in a temporary draft dispense. Most of those coil boxes and cold plates, the pressure is going to run anywhere from about maybe 18 pounds to upwards of 28, maybe even 30 pounds. That's a pretty broad range, but you can just kind of fluctuate it and adjust it on the fly.
Gotcha. Let's see. Alfred also wrote, Neil, do you think a glycol cooler is overkill for a draft line that will be going through a wall, max line not exceeding 10 feet?
You cut out there for a second. So max line 10 feet?
Yep.
The nice thing about glycol systems in the past 10 years is that the cost of a chiller unit has gone way down. You can get some pretty inexpensive glycol chillers for under $1,000. My rule of thumb over the years has really developed into, if the lines leave the cooler, turn it into a glycol system. It's the most efficient way to cool draft beer. The only other way to really cool it if your lines leave the cooler is through a blower system, and the blower systems are notoriously unreliable. I don't think it's overkill at all. You could find used glycol units or some brand new ones for pretty cheap. Beer line bundle for that short distance is really cheap. It's, you know, it's I think it's a good way to go.
Definitely. Let's see what other questions there are. So Kyle wrote, can you talk about adjusting the gas blend for long draw systems, i.e. the length of the run increases?
So if the length of the run increases, then you typically need to have a higher pressure in order to push the beer at the same flow rate. That would be the assumption, at least. And if you need a higher pressure, you need to adjust the gas blend down to not to keep the same balance point in your kegs. That's generally speaking how those numbers would relate to each other. Without seeing without seeing actually what the situation is, it's hard to say. I will tell you that McDantum has a really great gas blend calculator. And if you go to McDantum's website, that's McDantum.com, McDantim. McDantum. They make pretty much all the gas blenders in the industry, and they've got a really great calculator where you can plug in volumes of CO2, even alcohol content of the beer, which does affect solubility, temperature, pressure, and it'll spit out your ideal gas blend. Or you can use another form of the calculator where you plug in all the parameters and it tells you what your ideal pressure is. And you can play with all those parameters and you can kind of see what fits together and what doesn't. So it's a great way to kind of get familiar with all those parameters and see, like, all right, so I need to increase my pressure 5 pounds. What do I have to do with my gas blend? And it just spits that number out to you. So it's really cool. So I would recommend checking that out.
Yeah, it sounds really helpful. Another question, which I'm sure is relevant to a lot of us. Is there a recommended length of line in the double tap kegerator?
Recommended length of line in just a regular kegerator box. I typically use 5 feet of 3/16 inch vinyl tubing, just across the board. Typically, and especially in long draw systems, we're kind of building the system around the pressure that we've determined we have to have on the keg. And when we do that, we're taking different materials of line, different diameters of tubing, and taking all the factors of resistance and adjusting all kinds of things to get the flow rate. In a keg box, it's pretty simple. Your applied pressure with straight CO2 for most beers is going to be somewhere between like 11 pounds or maybe 10 and 15 pounds, I'd say. And that 5 feet is probably going to work perfect for just about all of it. So I just usually 5, sometimes 6 feet if you like it to pour a little bit slower. But yeah, 5 feet of 3/16 inch ID vinyl tubing. That's what you want.
All right. Well, I think that pretty much wraps up all the questions that have come in so far. If any others come in, we'll certainly make sure to enter them on the YouTube page.
Great.
If you guys have any other, feel free to message us as well through the contact info on the Eventbrite page. Thank you all so much for all the questions. Thank you so much, Neil, for spending the time with us to teach us more about draft systems. It's been incredibly informative.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, I guess one last question: favorite beer and favorite draft system to drink it from?
Favorite beer, favorite draft system. So Boulevard Pale Ale is my go-to beer. That's my desert island beer, and it always tastes best on my draft system here at home.
Only fitting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're going to sign off, but thanks again, Neil.
Great. Thanks a lot.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.